Well, folks, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. If you're joining me here nice and early over at Marvel Snap Zone, welcome back for our weekly tier list segment, the final weekly tier list segment of the Power Cosmic season, and the first one of this brand new year. The Power Cosmic season comes to an end today in just a few hours, and what a roller coaster it has been. From Series 4 to Series 5 being released over the course of the month, from the very start of this month, to Sera Surfer becoming one of the most impactful season pass cards we have ever seen. December 2022 was a busy month for Marvel Snap. However, just as we think we're starting to get some clarity regarding the current best decks of the format, Zabu is about to enter the game and mess things up. In these tier list rankings, we're obviously going to be looking at what decks we think will be the best for you going into the new season and explain why they make sense currently or the threats that they need to, be looking out for going forward. But we do feel obligated to run a small disclaimer for you this week, as the new season pass card Zabu is anticipated to be as impactful as Sera Surfer, if not potentially more so. If that happens and the card is, powerful and correct, and I'm a strong believer that it will be, then the rankings are obviously going to change quite a lot in the immediate future, especially for the decks aiming to develop their own strategy and not just being packed with reactive, disruptive cards in their core build. Particularly, we think Sera Surfer builds could be in a bit of trouble, as they're finally going to have another archetype that can show down against them when it comes to points, rather than the opponent looking to disrupt them with something like Cosmo or Leech. Also, this might make some of the best cards in the format a bit weaker. We're thinking Leech, Leader, or maybe even Aero, as these cards are going to come down too late against the Zabu on turn 3. If the opponent manages to play 2 4-cost cards on turn 4, these currently great cards might just be far too late to have the same kind of impact on a game they are largely having right now. However, all of these are a bunch of maybes for now, and it might take a little while before we figure out how to really abuse the power of Zabu as it releases in its current data mined form. So until then, let's focus on the decks that have dominated the very end of the Cosmic Power season, take a look at how they got there, as well as the source of their dominance over the current metagame. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. Would love to see you for more Marvel Snap Zone content here each and every day over on the YouTube channel. So make sure you leave a comment down below for algorithm reasons and like the video to help keep it happy in a very, very similar vein. At the same time, before we get started with things today, I just want to take a second to thank all of the sources used to create this tier list. Of course, tier lists are naturally opinionated pieces, but we do our best to back up the tier list with some kind of facts and data. Thankfully, that is becoming easier each and every passing week thanks to the Marvel Snap Zone and Snap Pro tracker, which you can now download the beta for if you're playing on the Steam client on your PC. All kinds of data is slowly becoming available from this, including players' most popular decks, average cube rates per game, average deck win rates, play rates depending on pool, what rank you are, what your collection level is, all kinds of useful data that Den is able to use to help inform this tier list. So if you want to help us make this more accurate, the best thing you can do is go and download that tracker today and start improving your Marvel Snap experience with it, so your data gets added to the data pool. SnapFan and the community Discord server they run obviously add great data to this as well, and we very much appreciate their input in that regard. Snapdecks, the team over on Twitter, sharing all of the decks making it infinite from the community as they get shared out on social media. We appreciate their input on this as well. Marvel Snap IO and all of the players who take the time to come and chat with us and let us know what they think about Marvel Snap and their insights. We really appreciate you and wouldn't be able to make this content without you. Okay, let's go. Let's take a look at all things tier list for this week and see where everything lands. So, as always with the tier list, we have everything available in full in the article in the description box down below, written by Den CCG. We cover things from tier 3 upwards in the video, just to try and keep the length in check. So if you are looking for any of these sweet looking tier 4 and budget options on this week's tier list, go and check out that article, give them a click, you'll get your deck lists available for you down there to export and play right now, much like every single deck you see featured in the tier list. However, we're going to take a look at Tier 3 to start with. A good selection of decks finding themselves in Tier 3 this week, but not all that much movement from the previous week just after the Christmas period. Thanos Zoo, Thanos Valkyrie, Bounce, whatever you might want to be calling that deck, finding itself as a stronghold of Tier 3 at the moment. More players slowly getting hands on cards required to play that deck and starting to refine that archetype. Zerocula, a deck we featured on the channel very recently with a dedicated deck video, picked up by the community in spades and fantastic results being had by all, finds itself in Tier 3 this week. Lockjaw Reveal and its partner in crime, Wong Reveal, not the powerhouses they used to be, plenty of Cosmo in the meta game at this moment in time, still very powerful when they get to enact their game plan though, gives them a Tier 3 berth this week. Cerebro 2, a deck very popular in the community, many creators making videos on this one and many folks reaching out to us about their infinite journeys with Cerebro 2, gives it a Tier 3 berth this time around. Last but not least, Ongoing Destroyer, the old man is hanging on by the skin of its teeth, a deck that really hasn't had the chance to innovate very much, but is still doing something very powerful. So while people do know what's up, know when to retreat, and know when to snap against you, you can still have a powerful proactive game plan with this one, leads it to appear at the bottom of Tier 3 this week. Tier 2, things shaking up just a little bit more, but again, pretty solved until Zabu appears for us in the Season Pass. Starting things off with Sera Control at the bottom of Tier 2 this week. If you're looking for a way to not be fighting for the priority that all these other players want, Sera Control is the deck for you. Playing reactive control pieces to kind of counteract that proactive game plan that so many people are looking to pressure right now. Patriot finds itself in Tier 2 because it's doing a fantastic job at evolving. More standard lists obviously seeing plenty of play, but all kinds of results this week from Surfer style hybrid lists with Patriot, giving you this kind of 1-2 punch and different game plans to play towards that may confuse the opponent on the final turns of the game. Electro Ramp and similarly Galactus Ramp, both finding themselves in Tier 2 this week. Two different reasons to play these decks we'll go into in a little more detail in the dedicated deck descriptions in a moment, but playing big things early is the name of the game with these, something that is very strong in Marvel Snap right now. Up next, Baero, making itself a Tier 2 choice this week, a deck that was falling out of favour just a bit with all the Surfer shenanigans that were going on. Metagame has adjusted slightly to allow it to make somewhat of a comeback, and I look forward to telling you all about why. The good cards decks seem to find themselves as the champions of Tier 2 at the moment. This kind of covers the Leech Leader strategies, and also these Devil Dinosaur Moon Girl shells that are mostly packed with the same cards otherwise. We'll break down the different ways you're able to build this below, but this one proving to still be strong and the choice of many to make infinite towards the end of the season. Tier 1 this week, however, is very much a selection of 3 decks and a tale of the power cosmic. Sera Surfer remains the kingpin of Marvel Snap heading into the Savage Land seasons. Sera Surfer and Negative Surfer, both exceptionally strong choices if you're looking to make a late final gambit to get up to infinite. Different reasons to play both, however, so stay tuned for more on that. The other deck that finds itself in Tier 1 this week is the Shuri Zero Panther style shell, whatever you might wish to call it. This deck has been evolving constantly and it's all about stats and offering you flexibility going into the final turns of the game. Really sweet to see this one continuing to innovate and showcasing the power of not only Zero and Red Skull, but that package of Shuri into Big Thing, alternatively into Shuri into Thing into Taskmaster in the Zero shell. Looking forward to taking a closer look at that one as well. Okay, that's our tier list for this week. Let's start breaking things down in a little bit more detail, starting with the big hitters over in Tier 1. Let's start with Sera Surfer. While Psylocke and Mr. Negative pack more of a high roll than this deck, the Sera build kind of seems to have won the competition of Silver Surfer builds in the end. The deck feels more reliable and tends to have more people stay in a game more often, while Mr. Negative can often be met with a very quick retreat once he hits the board. Additionally, the Sera deck is playing just better cards overall and can simply win through dropping its 3-cost cards, a turn 6 Brood alongside a Silver Surfer. Lastly, from a player's standpoint, the Sera deck feels easier to read and visualize heading into the future, something that's a big deal for folks who are looking to make a late push with a deck they might not have played before. The big difference in between the two builds is that Mr. Negative makes you play with the cards in your deck, and Sera wants you to focus on the cards that are in your hand. And as such, Sera makes it easier to visualize what the rest of the game is going to look like for you, creating an easier decision process to know when to snap and when to retreat. If you've never played this one before, the play patterns are really quite simple. You're looking to play a 3-cost card on turn 3, another 3-cost card, and occasionally Bast as well on turn number 4. Play Sera on turn 5, and then play a selection of 3-cost cards that now all cost 2, including Sera Surfer on turn 6. When it's presented like this, the deck doesn't seem very flexible, but the whole point is that you have so many 3-cost cards that you can use them flexibly depending on the game status. Cards like Bishop and Mr. Fantastic are very non-committal, meaning their effects is the same on the game state regardless of what your opponent is doing. Things like Cosmo, Killmonger and Polaris, however, are far more matchup based and can help derail the opposing strategy. Lastly, Maximus and Brood are your big payoff cards, which tip the opponent as to where we will be investing the largest amount of points. Ideally, we want to keep those for the last turn to keep that a secret for as long as we can. If you're looking for other additions or changes to this deck, there is a few things you can do if you're looking to play these cards and you're missing things from the deck list. Sera isn't quite as annoying as Mr. Negative when it comes to including cards in her deck, because many other cards can work as substitutes in this case. Things like Storm and Juggernaut are a nice duo inside of this deck if you're missing a selection of the 3-drops to be playable. Domino can be played as a guaranteed 2-cost card on turn 2, and then either play like double 1 costs instead if you don't want to have access to a card that way, or you can just add another 3-cost card instead if you prefer. Wolfsbane, another good card when it comes to raw points on the final turn of the game. It can replace Bishop or something else if you're more about playing for late points rather than setting them up early. Nova, a card you can consider to play well with Killmonger if you're also looking to add more stats to the end game board and don't have other cards that do so. Last but not least, Lizard is a fantastic option for this deck as well, as another 2-cost card that can help you seize priority in the games where that matters. Up next, Shuri, Zero, Panther, arguably the most favourite deck of many at the moment going into this tier list, but one that is kind of prohibitively held behind the paywall of Shuri for a number of folks. The current metagame really does seem to be seeing 2 types of deck doing well. Those with a clear path to developing lots of points, such as Sera Surfer, and those looking to seize priority and disrupt opposing strategies with counter cards. In that ocean of decks, Shuri Zero at its core definitely fits into the first category. However, because it isn't as demanding in terms of cards compared to a Sera Surfer build, it can still pack annoying cards for the opponent like Armor, or play alternative routes of play around the common disruptive tools the metagame tends to offer. This mixing of a little bit of everything sees Zero and Shuri being the backbone of this strategy. They serve as a crossroads to make Red Skull, Arnim Zola, Black Panther, Wong and Maximus all make sense when they're tossed into the same deck together. A little bit of a side note here, but Shuri and Wong are probably the 2 cards to watch for once Zabu enters the game as well, as I have a feeling those 2 are going to be pretty nuts when they only cost 2 energy. This deck is the definition of how to split your game plan into 2 parts when building a deck. Part 1 is to seize priority here, develop points and play around the revealing locations. Part 2 is going to be playing Shuri or Wong into Red Skull or Panther, into Arnim Zola or Taskmaster. Sometimes Part 2 ends up being playing Shuri on 4, passing on turn 5 and playing She-Hulk and Taskmaster on turn 6. The Part 3 of this equation is to simply look at the ridiculous amount of points that you have on the table and maybe think about where in this equation you were supposed to snap. As a result, the deck's game plan is quite easy to figure out based on your hand at that moment in time. The big emphasis should be maximising your chances of realising your win conditions, planning ahead of how your opponent could potentially try and interact with you. If you're looking for additions to this deck to play it and you're missing cards, the deck takes inspiration from the Wong on Reveal build and the Zero archetype, so you can try and pick those deck lists apart to find reasonable substitutions. However, apart from Armor and She-Hulk, all of the other cards in the deck are kind of part of a bigger package. It makes them quite difficult to replace by themselves. You could look at a card like Okoye instead of Armor if you want to maximize your points at the cost of Shang-Chi maybe ruining your combo. You could look at a card like Sandman if you're worried about all these Silver Surfer strategies instead of a card like Wong to give you better game there. Maybe you could look at playing Baero over a card like She-Hulk to give you more ways to annoy your opponent overall, but reducing your endgame combo potential. There's another version of this deck being played by many, commonly referred to as Shuri Pile, that just happens to play more good cards on average. If you're looking for another way of playing something like this, maybe removing the Zero side of things and moving more towards this generic good card version of Shuri might very well be the way to go. Up next, Negative Silver Surfer, still holding its own even though it is slightly less favoured than the Sera versions of this deck right now. This is probably the best deck in the metagame when everything goes to plan. Mr. Negative is almost way too famous nowadays to trick anyone into staying in a game where one would snap after turn 2 or turn 3. As a result, this deck has arguably fallen victim to its own popularity and is struggling to score quite as many cubes regularly. Most of the time, this deck wants the opponent to snap thinking they're in a good position, and then punish them with a counter snap, which doesn't happen very often. Overall, it feels like the Sera build has taken over as the more reliable deck, being able to get opponents to stay in more games while winning a similar number of them. The obvious game plan with this deck is Mr. Negative on turn 4, sometimes on turn 3 if you find an early Psylocke, then a 3 and a 2 on turn 5 and unleash the entire barrage on turn 6, profiting from the cards you have inverted with Mr. Negative. Even without Mr. Negative, the deck still has some solid play patterns to try and win 2 locations. Brood combined with Silver Surfer can easily win a lane with 15 power all by itself. Rogue can be a quite nice surprise card, considering there are many good ongoing abilities currently. Stealing a thing like Blue Marvel or Devil Dinosaur can be game-winning all by itself. Bast and a 3 cost into Iron Man with 3 power, into 2 3 cost cards like Mystique or Silver Surfer can also be a solid development on the final turns of the game. Obviously, most cards with a power lower to their cost can be considered for this deck if you're looking for potential replacements, especially if they are a 3 cost card that plays well with Silver Surfer. Wolfsbane is definitely a great card in the deck in that regard. Other noticeable inclusions include things like Forge, Ironheart, or sometimes even things like Jane Foster alongside Morph in order to really amp up the high roll potential of a deck like this, although that certainly isn't optimal if you're looking to make the climb. We move on down to tier number 2 this week, and first of all we'll take a look at the good cards strategy. As the season comes to a close, this good cards archetype saw a lot of players turning to it for help, even through the now expected Leech Leader play pattern or the Devil Dinosaur Moon Girl duo instead. The deck didn't really get better with time, as it didn't have to evolve, to be fair, it just stayed pretty close to its basic recipe. The true upside of this deck is it's quite simple to play in comparison to the other high profile decks in the current metagame. It has very simple play patterns, a down to earth concept, so this deck feels perfect for anyone without much confidence in their abilities that's looking for a late season push. You're trying to get priority early on with this one. Lizard and Maximus are key there. Keep the priority, I should say, while gathering information with White Queen, a large statted 4-cost card, and then just dictate the final 2 turns of the game with effects like Baero and Leader. If this plan fails or the draws don't align, you have other backup plans because you have other good cards on every single cost along the curve of the game. If you're looking for additions to this one, looking for things you can replace, anything that can score you a ton of points should be fine in this list, and there's a lot of variations of this build as a result. Things like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur can work very well instead of Shang-Chi and Magneto. It also opens up a very sweet double Maximus play on turn 6. Enchantress, a card that's going to be getting very popular moving forward, and things like Cosmo, other counter cards for example, can replace Shang-Chi in the flexible anti-meta slot. Polaris or other high scoring cards for their cost make a lot of sense, as long as their ability has some utility to us over the course of a game, and something like Doctor Doom might be beneficial for you as another good 6 if you're missing a card like Magneto. Moving swiftly on to She-Hulk Baero, a fan favourite that is slowly making somewhat of a comeback. The metagame has started to adjust to the leader and arrow being in every deck portion of the game, and more highly synergistic builds with lots of cheap cards have emerged. While Baero might have a problem with leader countering its turn 6, it certainly doesn't have a problem with dealing with a sea of 1-cost cards as long as it can draw into Killmonger. As a result, after a few weeks stumbling to adapt to the current format, Baero seems to finally make a lot of sense and should be back as a contender. We've yet to confirm exactly if Wave will work with Zabu, but if it does, expect to see a lot more of Baero in the near future. The whole point of this deck is to be able to get 2 destroy effects while having reveal priority on turn number 6. This should be achieved with a simple on-curve play pattern during the first 4 turns, as the destroy synergy is able to generate solid power through its staples like Bucky Barnes, Deathlock and Carnage. Turn 5 should be your wave play, and nothing else if we have She-Hulk in hand, so the card can be a 2-cost next turn when paired with Arrow or Leader. If we manage to destroy 4 of our own things, Death can become free, and both her and She-Hulk can be played in addition to another card. Squirrel Girl is included for that reason. Being destroyed with Killmonger usually is the way to get 4 destructions to have that play pattern available to you. Outside of this, however, the deck is looking to maximise energy usage. The deck is still very flexible all round and is able to develop points without drawing into wave. The destroy synergy especially shines when it comes to clearing out annoying cards that would appear on your side of the board, be it from locations or from your opponent. If you're looking for replacements in this archetype, the deck usually rotates through a selection of 4 different 1-drops, Nova, Yondu, the Hood, and Squirrel Girl, all having different merits in certain metagames. Mysterio, another card that is included in this deck, sometimes serving as good destroy fodder while setting up some points for the late game. Lastly, America Chavez can make a lot of sense in this build, as she makes the deck more reliable, helping you find wave more often before turn 5. Up next, we take a look at Galactus, the card, it's kind of the only one, I think, from Series 5 that has ended up with an archetype named after it. While Galactus should be more and more predictable as time passes, it seems like the end of the season has been a good time to play this deck. It might be the case that players are just focusing on their own gameplay rather than what the opponent is doing, or simply that players still fighting for the infinite rank aren't used to facing this card as much. Nevertheless, Galactus seems to be performing well currently, and the lists build around finding Galactus reliably. They seem to be doing a bit better than the more high-roll orientated ones that are stronger after they land Galactus itself. The archetype is a curiosity of mine once Zabu releases, as synergy-orientated decks tend to not include that many tech cards early in their development. Galactus could be a very nice way to punish the Zabu players who thought it could just develop their curve and forget about what the opponent is doing. This deck really has 2 key turns. Turn 4 and 5, or 4 and 6, depending on your hand, leaving the rest of the game to do whatever you really want to. If you play Electro on turn 3, your turn 4 really should be Leech or Dr. Octopus. Both cards serve a similar purpose of disabling the opponent's hand and being unable to compete when you play Galactus on turn 5. Snap timing is absolutely key in this game plan, as most opponents are going to retreat from you as soon as they figure out what is going on. The other way of getting Galactus out is through Wave on turn 3, then we have a flexible turn 5, and we'll likely look to Shang-Chi plus Death on turn 6 without priority in order to beat an opposing leader. In that sequence, turn 5 is quite flexible and can be dedicated to pushing for points with a card like Maximus, or trying to cancel the opponent's turn 6 with Leech or Dr. Octopus, if we have a read the opponent is playing something more synergistic. If you're looking for different cards or changes for this deck, Galactus builds seem to change quite a lot from week to week, so a lot of potential additions are definitely on the menu already. Ebony Maw is great at securing priority for Galactus, especially as Electro is a weak turn 3 in terms of power. Cards like Wolverine, Sabretooth, even Green Goblin and Hobgoblin all have nice synergy with Galactus, but they are a huge tell of what you're playing to the opponent. Baero can be included here, of course. Before Galactus, she can help make sure the opponent doesn't have too many points on a lane that you intend on keeping active. Psylocke gives you the option of gaining energy to accelerate, much like Electro and Wave do. Daredevil sees play in this deck on a number of occasions. When you're looking to play Galactus on turn 5, courtesy of Electro, he can offer you some very valuable information about your opponent's plans. Destroyer also sees plenty of play in this archetype as an alternative plan when you don't draw Galactus. It will destroy your Electro and open up for a Maximus plus Shang-Chi play on turn number 6. Last but not least, Null finds itself in the deck, an obvious replacement to certain things, but consistency seems more important than the high roll potential of this card currently, so do keep that one in mind. Electro Ramp coming up for you next. In our book, Electro is the best deck if I had to recommend a deck to someone that has no Marvel Snap experience and is looking to climb the ladder. The archetype has a very simple play pattern, and through playing only one card a turn, you will limit the decision-making process that you have to make for your pilot. Most of the time, however, landing Electro on turn 3 and Leech on turn 4 is enough for your opponent to just get out of there. Otherwise, the deck still is able to compete for points on several lanes thanks to some very powerful 6-cost cards. The trick is to simply know the deck's limitations, as it obviously isn't as flexible as the other decks that find itself high on this list. This is going to lead to more non-games where you just have to accept your 1-cube loss, move on to the next one, and make your good hands count. If you're looking to play this one, you're relying on two simple play patterns, really. Turn 1 and Turn 2 are ideally Sunspot plus Armor to protect it from Killmonger. Ebony Maw, great at taking priority here instead if you happen to draw that one, especially if you have Electro or Leech and you want to avoid an opposing Cosmo. Turn 3 is the key turn, where you should look to play Electro if you can, but you can also play Wave into a 6 while allowing yourself to play Leech on turn 5 still. Once you're at 5 energy, you need to pick whether you're going to be disrupting your opponent, going for raw points before slamming your big 6-cost cards. It should be the bigger cards to help you choose which of your better 5-cost cards is correct to play. Sandman doesn't really fit any play pattern here, unfortunately. It's usually just played to counter certain opponents rather than develop your own plans. If you're looking to make changes here, there are a number of things you can do. Although I would tend to keep the on-reveal theme strong in the 5 and 6 cost cards, there are a number of additions that can make this list. Baero, of course, sees plenty of play in decks like this over a card like Leech if you don't prefer to be quite so proactively reactive, I guess. Captain Marvel, Vision, these are cards that are nice and flexible and will completely ignore an opposing arrow from ruining your plans in the mid-game. Lizard and Scorpion are cards that see play in this deck sometimes, as well as solid 2-cost cards depending on what you are trying to accomplish or counter, and things like Black Panther and Arnim Zola can offer you alternative top-end finishers that support Ebony Maw exceptionally well. Up next, we have Patriot, continuing to evolve as the metagame goes around it. This more stock list is the place we're going to start, as it's still having pretty good results. It's definitely the oldest archetype that's high in our rankings at this point, but Patriot keeps being relevant even though it suffers from most players knowing pretty precisely what to expect from it. Recently, we saw Patriot being mixed with the Sera Surfer core, and it seems to have had some pretty decent results. I guess at this point the deck reached its ceiling and represents a solid option overall, but it can need that little twist if it wants to compete with the best decks out there. The goal of this archetype is to abuse Patriot's ability to grow all of your vanilla units, which can come in many forms, either cards you choose to play in your deck or ones you generate like Debris Rocks or Ultron's drones. The biggest challenge with this deck is to place your cards correctly. Patriot and Mystique are very weak in terms of points. You need to win the other two lanes, even if you need to get some help from Onslaught or Ultron to reach the points required to do so. If you take a look at the deck, you'll see that every card either helps boost the other ones or is a vanilla synergy. Ideally, we want to have 2 vanilla lanes and one that contains all of the boosted cards, sometimes hidden behind Invisible Woman to help keep them safe. Enchantress on Patriot will usually lead to you running away, and with the current metagame being more about developing points and Leech being more popular than Enchantress, most of the time you could just play out a card like Patriot before turn 5, even though it gave away your whole game plan. That might not be true going forward though. If you're looking for potential additions in this, greedier, more combo-orientated builds exist, including cards like Sera, Wave, and Magic, leading to a potentially higher point ceiling. But with Leech being in the metagame, we'd rather just play a more proactive game plan personally, and not try and keep cards in our hand for too long. If you're looking at that Surfer Patriot list, you want an idea of what that looks like, we'll pop it up on screen for you now, and this hybrid is still definitely a work in progress for a number of people, but it's putting up good results and showcasing the synergy between these archetypes in that you can have cards like Cyclops that offer crossover and gain bonuses from both payoffs. You'll find Sera Control next on our tier list this week, a more traditional, very old school version of Sera Miracle. Reactive decks are not the norm currently, and until now, nearly every deck on this list has been focusing on its own points rather than disrupting the opponent's game plan. Galactus and Electro have disruptive potential, but they aren't starting the match with the intention of countering what the opponent does. This makes Sera Control a deck that looks to find out the opponent's game plan and abuse this information, and that's a bit of an odd pick in the current metagame. It seems to work fine so far though. Shang-Chi and Enchantress routinely find situations to shine and to steal a game by themselves. Particularly, this deck is great at making the opponent feel like they're very much in control, snap, and then get punished when the counter cards come down on turn 6, thanks to Sera. What's limiting this deck at the moment is the current power level of things you're trying to beat, as a slight mistake with this one can cost you the game immediately. But towards the end of the season, where you tend to see a lot of the same decks, it might be a bit easier to anticipate your opponent's next move, and you'll tend to see the same play patterns repeating from one game to another. The deck is looking to win a lane with points while taking over another one on turn 6 thanks to its reactive tools. The lane we intend to win on points will usually be solidified by Angela or Carnage, both reaching 6 points for a 2-cost card quite often. We can also use the real Mysterio or Forge's boost in order to make a lane stronger. Typically, it's also the lane we intend to play Sera on later on. The second lane will usually be where we intend to punish our opponent's turn 6, swinging momentum back with Shang-Chi, Enchantress, and now Valkyrie too, giving a lot of value to Forge or a fake Mysterio that's just looking harmless right until that point. On some rare occasions, we can even contest an empty lane all at once with Brood plus Valkyrie, or through destroying Nova with Killmonger. If you're looking for additions to this one, Sera Miracle is arguably the most flexible archetype that Marvel Snap has ever seen. So the important thing is to understand the game concepts you're trying to abuse with this deck. Ant-Man is a card that seems strong with Valkyrie, as he can win a lane and they're playable together on turn 6. Armor as well is a good card in the build to annoy the destroy decks if you need to, and protect your own Ant-Man from your Killmonger. The biggest hurdle for a lot of people here is probably going to be Valkyrie, which makes a lot of other cards worse if we're taking it out. Things like Mr. Sinister or Brood are not quite as powerful, especially Forge when we don't have a card like Valkyrie. There's another way you can build this deck, courtesy of another Marvel Snap Zone contributor, Paper, available for you here if you want to take a peek. We move on down to tier number 3, Thanos Zoo, finding itself as the kingpin of tier 3 this week, an archetype that slowly but surely more people are getting their hands on and getting the cards required to play and learn how to innovate. Zoo, Bounce, whatever you might want to call this one, Killmonger is unfortunately making a return in the current metagame, and that's pretty bad news for a deck like this. The decks seem to be settling down on the Khazar variation lately, focusing on spreading a ton of points across 3 lanes, but that plan is being heavily punished by Killmonger. The only reliable way to use Khazar right now is to wait until turn 6 to play your 1-cost cards, and that means passing up on the on-reveal ability of your stones, which seems like far too big of a setback. This forces the deck to adapt, both in the cards it's playing and the play patterns it uses. For a deck that was already among the most difficult to pilot, this is yet another hurdle to overcome, and logically dipped its performance a bit over this past week. The simple formula here is to be able to contest 2 lanes, using cards like Angela, Bishop and Valkyrie potentially stealing one all by itself on the final turn of the game. We can then support that with our cheap buffed units, which usually contribute for 6 to 10 additional points. Beast and Carnage help free up space or get our cards back into our hand, so we can play more of them for Bishop and keep the ball rolling. Blue Marvel then buffs up every single location all at the same time. The reality is you better be paying attention when you're playing this deck. You gotta manage your hand size pretty vigorously. On reveal, orders and space on the board to play this deck to its full potential, they all matter. Most of the time, the ideal scenario is to have Angela on your bouncing lane as to grow her through replaying cards behind her. Bishop on the lane we anticipate to play cards on that we do not intend to bounce or destroy, such as Blue Marvel and Quinjet. And then lastly, have a lane to just dump out stuff to be eaten by Carnage when we need space, or to use Valkyrie on late to steal it on turn 6. Spider-Man is secretly a real all-star in this deck, as we can play on all lanes at once. We should routinely find a lane we can lock off on turn 5 and make it very easy to win, while we focus on another one that we need to get to complete victory. Thanos will occasionally contribute an 18 power card, but I wouldn't play for that to happen. See it more as an opportunistic event when it does. If you're looking for additions for this one, Iceman would be the most flexible card to remove. Spider-Man and Kazar are great for this deck, but also not vital to the overall game plan. A card like Devil Dinosaur can give you another win condition on a lane and reward you for not playing cards when your board is already full. Mystique, when you have all your locations and your hand super full, can also give you a +10 bonus if you can copy something like Blue Marvel or Devil Dinosaur. Kazar is a staple in, most decks, except for when Killmonger is popular, so we can be looking to remove it, perhaps, to give ourselves some more flexibility, and we want more utility cards instead of buffing up stones we expect not to be there when the game ends. Ant-Man, Mojo, these are all good, nice Valkyrie targets for an overall synergy, but they usually feel like a bit of overkill. And Armor could potentially be a pretty strong inclusion if Killmonger is making a comeback for this deck. Up next, we have a deck called Zerocula. We made a pretty reasonable in-depth video on this one earlier this week. Much to everyone's joy, this deck seems to have found itself giving a fresh spin on the traditional Kazoo archetype and giving more people more ways to play it and more things to look forward to. This deck is looking to quickly develop your side of the table to allow for some flexibility in the later turns. This is going to make it much easier to play around the usual suspects of things like Aero, Leech, or Leader in your later turns. Also, emptying your hand allows you to set up a great Infinite discard from Dracula, or simply sometimes you can just pass on turn 5 and play it out for raw stats that way too. There aren't any specific spread of points that make more sense than any other. The deck can go really hard on 2 lanes, pairing cheap cards with Dracula in one and just slamming a Red Skull on the other. Alternatively, we can spread its points more often and simply assume one of our big scorers is going to contest a 3rd lane all by itself. Thanks to being, in the lead often in most games, you should be able to try your luck with Cosmo or Armor at times. Sometimes you're just going to snipe very important abilities for your opponent. If you're looking for changes for this archetype, Kazoo is an archetype that evolves pretty constantly, as long as you stick around the basic concept. It relies on flooding the board and supporting your units. As such, the more expensive cards in the deck, apart from Kazar himself, can largely be replaced to create different play patterns. Sandman especially is a card that punishes the deck that you expect to see most at the moment, the Silver Surfer strategies overall, and help push this deck in another direction, focusing more on buffs from Spectrum, Blue Marvel or Claw to help break the parity that Sandman provides. Up next, we have Lockjaw on Reveal, a deck that is an old favourite of mine, but hasn't had the best of times recently. The on Reveal synergy is definitely struggling a bit this past week. Cosmo is arguably more popular than ever in several builds. In addition to this, Lockjaw just isn't a very reliable win condition compared to many of the other ways to generate points on this list. The high rolls are still able to compete with the best decks out there, but the average is less than good enough, unfortunately. Although Psylocke or the Time Stone can allow going into 2 6-cost cards to compete towards the end of the game, this deck still relies a lot on the deck's namesake card in the form of Lockjaw. Therefore, the way you win is to use your Infinity Stones, based on whether you need to draw a card or not. If you don't have Lockjaw in your hand, you probably want to be trying to draw. If you do have Lockjaw in your hand, draw only if you have several big cards already. You're going to be thinning your deck out and make it more likely to summon one of the few ones that you have left. One of the few reasons not to play stones without Lockjaw in hand could be a card like She-Hulk becoming playable on the next turn, for example. An important part of playing the stones and cards like Sunspot or Quinjet early on is to keep a lane free if you can. You can still abuse Lockjaw late in the game with Nightcrawler and some stones, so don't quit on it even if you don't draw it by turn 3. There are other ways to play this deck. The big cards that can be flexible, mostly all of them, apart from things like Thanos and probably the Infinite. As for an early curve, Armor seems to be great at protecting Quinjet, which makes Sunspot way more appealing too. I guess Iceman or other cheap on-reveal cards could definitely fit in here as a replacement as well. Things like Wasp, Thor, Jane Foster, that's a package that comes together normally. It doesn't seem to make too much sense in such a big deck, and should probably be kept for more of a traditional Lockjaw archetype, but that's somewhere you can look to go if you don't have a card like Thanos. Nightcrawler and Vision also appear to be pretty flexible cards in this deck, but it's nice to have flexibility, as those stones can often make it pretty difficult to play where you want to sometimes. Speaking of on reveal, Wong Reveal finds itself down in a similar tier this week for most of the same reasons in the form of the popularity of Cosmo. It was pretty excellent last week, actually. The Negative Surfer deck was the more popular of the two, less Cosmos to be seen, but now, with the Sera archetype kind of taking over, this one is definitely running into the Space Dog a bit more often. Wong Reveal just immediately dipped when that happened. It's just the fate of a deck that relies on a very specific synergy to compete. Whenever the punish isn't popular, the deck feels like a top 3 deck in the game, but as soon as the opponents start to adapt to it, it becomes way more difficult for Wong. You usually have 2 play patterns with this deck, all in on Wong or more flexible with Psylocke into double 6-cost card. All in on Wong lets you play Black Panther into Arnim Zola or White Tiger, into, Odin or Doctor Doom to replace any of those 6s to give you more ridiculous on-reveal triggers one way or the other. Or you can use Psylocke on turn 4 to unlock 2 turns with 6 energy, basically. You can now play Ironheart plus Wolfsbane or just Doctor Doom on turn 5 and then trigger these things again with Odin on turn 6. In the deck, the quiet stars are Ebony Maw and Storm. The first one is going to give you priority for your on-reveal cards later on, something that is surprisingly quite important and doesn't punish you much on the lane he's played because of cards like Doom and Arnim Zola. Storm simply limits opposing play patterns without punishing you, and usually allows you to play Wong somewhere else while the opponent tries to desperately contest the flooded area to make sure they aren't losing it immediately. If you're looking for potential additions, really anything with an on-reveal effect labelled onto it could theoretically make sense in this deck. But the second part of the game, in turns 4, 5, and 6, is really quite rigid. So you probably don't want to look at more expensive cards. You would much rather look at cheaper cards all around when trying to find replacements for this archetype. Cerebro 2 makes an appearance for us next. Killmonger coming back into the metagame kind of hasn't helped this one all that much. The deck definitely has found its groove though, and represents a pretty solid climbing option for a number of players, but it's also a pretty limited one compared to other decks. Zabu is of course a 2-power card, so who knows, maybe there is some genius that can emerge with that card. Wong is also a 2-power card, so is Super Skrull and Shuri, so maybe we have something we can work with there later down the line. This deck is, however, one of the easiest ones to play if you exclude the problem of playing your cards in the right places. Just develop as many 2-power cards as you can by turn 5, where you're then going to play Blue Marvel, and then on turn 6 you'll be looking to follow up with Cerebro and Mystique. With that sequence you'll end up with many 7-power cards on your side of the board, and likely be able to contest both lanes with 3 or 4 cards already on them. The trick with this deck is maximising your cards that have a chance to annoy the opponent. Things like Goose and Storm need to be played carefully to lock the opponent out of locations that would benefit from them playing into them. Mr. Sinister would be the card that makes the most sense to add to this deck if you're not playing it already, as it represents 2 more 2-power cards for you. It can replace something like Invisible Woman or Scorpion if you feel that's more important to your version of the deck. Daredevil is another card the deck is fine including, although it's rare you can really abuse the information given by it. And I know there are some madmen out there who love playing M'Baku in this archetype as well. We then have Ongoing Destroyer, arguably still a pretty popular deck, and popular enough to warrant to be listed in this tier list, I think, in the current metagame. However, the deck definitely feels like more of an old-timer at the moment that wasn't able to evolve the same way other decks have in order to stay relevant. Currently, although the deck is still a competitive option and among the simplest ones to pilot, it makes it a pretty great pick in that regard from ranks below 70. It's also one of the more anticipated decks, and it can be really hard to get away with more than 1 or 2 cubes against opponents who have faced this deck plenty in the past. In this take of the deck, we should be able to develop much more power and compete on all 3 lanes compared to traditional lists. We have cards like Warpath, Ebony Maw and Red Skull especially, which seem to be great at contesting a lane all by themselves and can receive support from Mr. Fantastic, Claw and Spectrum in a pinch. The rest of the deck is still true to the Ongoing Destroyer nature, aiming to develop ongoing effects that will disrupt the opponent while helping us develop on our side of the board. Armor and Cosmo are still annoying for a number of decks to face, and Goose is gaining traction slowly as more decks get more and more greedy. The card is especially helpful to prevent Leader or Aero from being played into a certain lane, limiting their disruptive potential. If you're looking for changes here, Lizard is a lot of points for a 2-cost card and can easily replace Goose or Invisible Woman if you don't see use in those. Mojo can be quite nice as well if you're playing against a lot of swarm strategies, but it feels difficult to get value from in this deck sometimes. Professor X is another 5-cost card you can consider playing alongside a card like Daredevil to give you more value from Professor X and Destroyer. More importantly, Professor X, just great with a nice synergy here alongside Destroyer, definitely worth including if you want to play that Daredevil package. Captain America can make your main line stronger, and most of the time the opponent will just let you have it and focus on the other 2 lanes. And Iron Man can often be a pretty easy replacement for Red Skull, who is included mostly because of Sandman in this version. With Zabu looking like an absolute powerhouse, I don't know how much I can tell you to trust these rankings this week, with just a few days left of the season. I fully expect several decks on this list to still perform very well, especially those who can limit Zabu's impact on the game, like Galactus, although I could easily imagine decks starting to include Enchantress the same way we did Shang-Chi at some point during the month. Good cards, Zero, and even Zabu decks themselves can easily find a spot for that, or Super Scroll as well. Silver Surfer decks have included Rogue in their build, which is another card that can help a ton against the new Season Pass card. And lastly, Sandman is another great tech that would make a lot of sense and give decks like Ongoing Destroyer and Kazoo more options to limit Zabu's power as well. In the end, we can see most decks on this list are able to mitigate how much damage Zabu can do, and should lead to a very interesting battle among new builds and the ones trying to keep their competitive nature. We'll make sure to let you know everything about it next week when we share the madness that typically unfolds during the first week of a new season. I hope everybody had a fantastic New Year weekend, and as usual, if you want to find myself, you can find me at HowlingMines over on Twitter or your choice of social media. You can get in contact with the article's creator, Den CCG, in the same way, or you can find the whole Marvel Snapstone team in our community Discord server, for which there is a link in the description box down below. Until next time, I have been HowlingMines, you've been amazing, and this has been Marvel Snapstone. Take care. Have a good one.